Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Agri-Food Tech in Australia, Destination ASEAN. My name's Kate Jarvis. I'm the moderator for today's session. I'm an agribusiness finance specialist at Asian Development Bank. Thank you everyone for attending. We have people in our webinar today from Cambodia, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, New Zealand, the United States, Singapore, Vietnam, Uruguay, and of course, Australia. This webinar is part of the evokeAG and Austrade Global Engagement Series, designed to build relationships and pathways and to identify opportunities with global agri-food stakeholders. evokeAG and Austrade have partnered with Future Food Asia to deliver this webinar, which aims to provide insights into the potential of the ASEAN region and ways to access its opportunities. We'd just like to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar to distribute through digital channels later in the week. Before we proceed, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have joined us today. Please allow me to introduce our panelists. Firstly, we have Isabelle Decitre, founder and CEO of ID Capital, a Singapore-based VC firm that focuses on sustainable and disruptive food solutions in Asia Pacific. ID Capital runs Future Food Asia, the first of its kind open innovation platform in the sector. We also have Jain, a senior business executive who has held global leadership roles with Ridley, ADM, Ingredion, and Syngenta. We have Paul Voutier, founder of Ambit Robotics, an Australian startup that has developed a crop spraying robot, especially for Southeast Asian farms. And we have Amelia Walsh, Trade and Investment Commissioner for Singapore at Austrade. Welcome, everybody. The format for today will be a panel discussion for around 45 minutes and then 15 minutes of Q&A with the audience. So we would really welcome everybody to type their questions into the chat as we go along, and we'll aim to address them when we have the opportunity at the end. So I'd like to start with a question for all of the panelists. What do you think are the main opportunities for Australian agri and food tech startups and scale-ups in the ASEAN region? Perhaps, Isabelle, we could start with you.
Good morning, Kate. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here, and hats off to our friends in Uruguay and in the Netherlands for starting so early or finishing so late. So opportunities in ASEAN, there are many. It's a bloc of 10 countries. It's a population of 650 million and a landmass which is covering more than the equivalent of India. But it's a mosaic of countries. You can appreciate there is a cliff between, say, Singapore and Myanmar. But there is also a cliff between Vietnam and Laos, for instance. So ASEAN is one of the most productive agricultural baskets in the world. And they have a large self-sufficiency ratio. So net-net, they're exporting. And a large part of the population is a growing, urbanized middle class with a higher purchasing power every year. And their food preferences are changing from food staples to higher value food. So if I want to summarize where the opportunities lie, I would say think of agri-tech opportunities being attached to smallholder farmers. And forgive me for making an exception for Singapore, of course. And think of food tech opportunities as being driven by an emerging urbanized middle class. So when I think opportunities, I have a kind of mental matrix in mind, which is made of, one line, types of opportunities. Is it a market? Is it a gateway to a market? Is it a place to find partners that could be manufacturing partners or a sourcing base? And fourth, is it a place to do R&D or to localize your product or your solution, whether it's the formulation of your product, whether it's the UI of your app? So that's my role for the matrix. And then the column is the countries. you will very easily narrow down to a few countries that you think are highly relevant for your solution and your product. So globally, I would say you have not so many commonalities, you have many, many differences across the countries. Singapore shines through its ethnic diversity, the capacity to offer a test bed for innovations in a safe, relatively sanitized environment. Next behind Singapore, I would say you have Thailand, big and loud, doubling down on agri-food tech with an impetus from the government, investors more and more. Several things like evolution of the regulatory framework to make it more friendly to founders, like they can get stock options and another series of small and bigger things. And that's probably where Thailand stands out versus a country like Malaysia, who is not at that level of development, although globally speaking, Malaysia is more advanced. Behind Singapore and Thailand, I would like to point on Indonesia, of course, just because of the sheer size of the market, the dynamics, but also its complexity. And there, if you give me 1 second to talk about the new kid on the block, watch Vietnam. Vietnam is not very visible at the moment in agri-food tech, but I believe in a few years' time, things would have changed. I have not forgotten Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines, Brunei. And let me just give you an anecdotal example. I think sometimes a nudge is enough to make it an opportunity for a startup. We've seen a startup developing a spirulina business in Brunei. Not that Brunei is a big market, but through some good incentive and support system, they made it an opportunity, which is a foot in the door in the ASEAN region.
Fantastic. That's very interesting. Thanks, Isabelle. Sid, perhaps we could hear from you. I think you're on mute, Sid.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Yeah,
we can now. Thank you,
Kate. Yeah, thanks to evokeAG as well as to Austrade for giving me this opportunity today. I mean, look, ASEAN for me is a tremendous opportunity for Australian startups and scale up. I think coming out of COVID, it's really seen as a trade bloc it is very important to Australia and continue in terms of what we've seen across the different economies. I guess when I look at opportunities for Australian startups and scale-ups, I really see three kind of opportunities. The first one is those startups that have an idea or are looking at scaling up. ASEAN economies really offer an opportunity to take the advanced technologies in agtech from Australia, realizing that a lot of those advanced technologies in Australia are for the large scale farming. So if there are opportunities for those technologies to be adapted to small scale, to the value chains in the ASEAN economies, I think it's a tremendous opportunity for those companies to really look at, the Vietnams, the Thailands, and Indonesia, etc., for adoption and for scale up. I think second most important opportunity is the opportunity to partner. And we'll talk a little bit today around partnering, not just with the corporate players in ASEAN, which are very localized and have tremendous presence and networks and understanding of the local systems. But more importantly, there in ASEAN, you do have individuals with high net worth who are either the shareholders or the founders of many of the large corporates that are in the food chain, in the value chain at the various junctions. These individuals bring with them a lot of networks, a lot of credibility, and I guess a lot of intent to look at innovation as a way of providing new solutions right across the value chain to the customers in their home markets. So I think partnering opportunity, not just the investments, not just the money, but really the partnering opportunity is something that is really attractive to the Australian companies when they look at ASEAN. I guess the third thing for me and for any investor in a startup, including any founder, is profitability. And profitability comes with, I guess, market access. And as Isabelle mentioned, 600 million plus people, a large emerging class of consumers looking at the right drivers, which are also existent in Australia: clean technology, green technologies, non-GM, healthy products, looking at, convenience. all of these do exist within the Asian economies. And market access, I think, especially for those companies that are looking at scaling up and beyond, is a very big attractive, is a big attractivity index across all of the Asian markets. But while I'm talking of the opportunities, I think there is a word of caution, which is ASEAN, like doing business in Australia, needs relationship. So any Australian startup, any Australian scale up, I think needs to be focused, needs to be patient, and needs to take some time to develop its networks, to be connected to forums that are being organized, at least in the Singapore ecosystem, things like Food Futures, for example, to really plug into those networks to identify who those partners could be, what those routes to market or models of working can be. But clearly, I think as we now sit in 2021 and towards the heading into the second quarter of 2021, ASEAN has shown a lot of resilience, and I'm quite confident that we'll see more collaboration between Australian entities and the ASEAN economies as we look ahead.
Thanks, Sid. Paul, would you be able to share your perspectives on what you think are the main opportunities for Australian startups and scale-ups in the ASEAN region?
Yeah, sure. I think the size of the opportunity, has to be understood. I think there are 73 million small family farms across Southeast Asia. That's a very large market, and that's a lot of farmers. And I think the other thing that is really interesting about Southeast Asia is that we have some really glaring inefficiencies in the way that the market currently operates. So if we look at the way that agricultural inputs are retailed in Southeast Asia, they're typically sold through very small stores. There's a lot of inefficiencies around the inventory that gets carried, the kind of margins that are required to sustain those retail operations. I think on the finance side, there's some really interesting opportunities because of the amount of interest that farmers are paying on those inputs when they buy seeds and fertilizers. I think the whole way that we provide finance to smallholder farmers in Southeast Asia could be a lot more efficient. And then on the logistics side, once those crops have been grown and they're trying to reach market, again, we have a whole lot of little tiny micro businesses that are trading those commodities into shops. And I think right across the value chain, because it's so fragmented, because there are so many farms, there's some really exciting opportunities for digital tools, which improve on those efficiencies, whether it's finance or logistics or the retail side of things. I think for Australian startups that have technologies, one, there's a big market, and two, there's some really glaring inefficiencies there that could be really solved by much better digitization. And I think for an Australian startup too, it's just a really exciting opportunity for impact. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur with the enthusiasm and the drive to make something happen in ASEAN, I think on the other side of that, when we get there, the impact that we can have on people's lives and livelihoods is really significant. And so, yeah, it's an exciting place to be operating.
Great, thank you. And Amelia, I think you may be with us now.
Kate, hoping you can hear me.
Yes, hi Amelia,
Fantastic.
Great, welcome.
I'm glad to be able to join. Apologies for the challenges. Just a couple of things I think, coming on to what Sid was sharing about sort of the drivers. Interesting things we've been seeing recently are around logistics technologies for food and ag supply chains. So obviously we've always been looking at safe and efficient supply chains, but COVID has made that even more important than ever. And we're even seeing, technologies at the moment, but we're also seeing specialized packaging that means food can access sea shipping rather than air freight. So gets to market with a longer shelf life. So that's been really interesting to see. The other thing about Singapore that's really interesting is the number of multinationals here who have got regional headquarters, and they might have Asia Pacific decision making, or perhaps they have a sort of a hotline back into the global HQ to get technologies into their global supply chain. So we work with the MNCs, and they might come to us with a specific problem statement. And they're looking for, say, Australian innovation or capability, or we're trying to sell that into them. And we're also trying to talk to the MNCs about, well, what's your pipeline for meeting scale-ups, and how can we help facilitate or smooth that? What we see sometimes, it's quite interesting, is that you might have an MNC with regional R&D in Singapore, production in a neighbouring country, and perhaps the raw commodity inputs coming out of Australia. So quite a nice regional story that could be an opportunity for you. The other thing, and Isabelle touched on this as well, sort of the growing demand for proteins and sort of healthy and functional foods, but also what we're seeing a lot of is this demand for alternative and plant-based proteins. So we're very proud of the V2 story. I'm sure you all know, but if not, it was a collaboration with Hungry Jack's and CSIRO, and now with global investment, including from Singapore Inc., and moving out into the region of Burger King's with plant-based Whoppers. So it's not just V2 that we're seeing. Some Australian plant-based products are selling better in ASEAN than at home, or in some cases, these categories are selling faster or growing faster than the non-plant-based products. And just the other one I'll just briefly touch on is that we're seeing some opportunities in halal food development and manufacturing. So in particular, Malaysia and Indonesia, it's a bit of a growing segment, but one that's perhaps had less focus.
Super interesting. Thanks, Amelia. I might keep you on the line if that's okay, and ask you if you could share with us a little bit about, you've just described really nicely the relationship between Austrade and the MNCs. I'd love to dive in a little bit more detail into what type of support you provide to Australian startups that are looking to launch in ASEAN. Could you share a little bit with us?
Yeah, sure. So, first, we're from the government. We're here to help, which, I think, people find funny sometimes, but it is true. And I know Isabelle will talk about sort of the government support in the Singapore ecosystem, but from the Australian perspective, Austrade actually has its own accelerator program. We call it the Landing Pad, and we're in 5 locations globally. So Tel Aviv, San Francisco, Berlin, Shanghai, and of course Singapore. And the Singapore program helps Australian scale-ups launching into ASEAN. So we're based in Singapore, but with an ASEAN focus. And, broad range of services that you'd be familiar with all accelerators. So mentors helping you with your go-to-market strategy, investment pitch training, which we all probably need, even if we think we don't, business introductions, and that includes into the MNCs and, other market insights. So we work with the local ecosystems. So in Singapore, that's Enterprise Singapore and the Singapore Food Agency. And also, as I said, sort of the multinationals. We're industry agnostic. We'd love to see more ag and agri-innovation companies. And I think people might know the Landing Pad as a sort of a couple of months program, a couple of times a year. And we're actually being a lot more flexible now. So we're doing boot camps and doing staggered start times. So don't be discouraged if you think you can't come to market at a certain time. And then the other thing is check with your state and territory. So they also have a lot of support at the moment for scale-ups who want to go global. A lot of their programs are called Going Global. So New South Wales and Queensland, and Victoria has Launch Vic. So yeah, that's just a couple of ways we can help.
Fantastic, thank you. Isabelle, maybe you could share with us, in addition to the opportunities that Amelia's just described that Austrade helps with, do you have any other suggestions for how Australian ag and food tech startups could approach ASEAN markets, how they could really get their foot in the door, potentially being, in Singapore as a starting place?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. I absolutely agree with everything Amelia said, and I would try to add to it and not repeat it. So just a few advices as to how Australian startup could consider ASEAN. Maybe the first point to be aware of is that thinking of your ASEAN strategy will really push you to fine-tune your value proposition. It is strategic introspection that is very healthy, and it's a tough one. So I think in particular, it would push you on the price and the commercial proof of concept. Let me delve into the price for 1 second. And let me take an example. For instance, how aquaculture innovation sometimes fails to address opportunities in ASEAN. The aquaculture innovation landscape is very polarized between innovation stemming from the salmon industry, mostly from Europe for the past, say, 50 years, and tropical aquaculture that needs different things, not just because the water is warmer, but also just because of the price point. So many innovations like areas, they fall flat to a wide extent because they are too expensive. And the commercial proof of concept for me is something I really started to think of when I saw many startups coming up with a technical proof of concept in their home country, but not paying sufficient attention to the fact that it doesn't prove it works in, say, Vietnam or Thailand. We recently spoke to an Indian startup who tried his luck in Vietnam to eventually realize that whatever they were trying to automate and successfully so in their own country could be done manually very cheaply in Vietnam. So there were no need. It's not that it didn't work, it's just that there were no need. A second point, and it's a segue into it, it's about understanding the local context. So for agriculture in particular, you really need to understand these subtle things like how government is subsidizing the industry, how local, regional, or national decisions are taken. That's a very, very important point. And for food tech, there is this old body of regulations that you need to have an idea of before venturing in any country. It's not about just knowing exactly how your product is going to be regulated, but having a sense of the predictability of the outcome. Going back to my matrix where we line up the types of opportunities, whether it's partnership, production-based, sourcing-based, chances are, as I said before, that you would very easily narrow down to 3-4 countries. So let me go a bit deeper into Singapore without being redundant with Amelia. Of course, Singapore offers the whole gamut of investors, accelerators, access to regional headquarters, a very strong support from the government. Think about this notion of network of investors. Do you need to be in Singapore to grab the attention of Singaporean investors? I don't believe so. Would it be more a case of inspiring trust because you have gotten a Singapore investor, which is a slightly different game, or inspiring trust because you have a local headquarters in Singapore? That's something you need to think of. Going back to accelerators, they are very good, and luckily you will probably find the accelerator you need if you need some support like the ones accelerators can provide. They give you a fantastic general understanding. They will help you brush up your pitch. They will usually maintain a very good relationship with a pool of investors that are keeping warm for their portfolio companies. So the good news is you will find great accelerators in several countries and one that will fit the bill for you most likely. There are many in Singapore as well. But think about some alternatives. Sometimes the best way to get the support you need is to develop a deep relationship with the client first and develop all this package of, access to market, guidance with them. Think about Future Food Asia. Our platform is really about allowing collaboration, notably with corporates. We really believe in the power of corporates. If you are able to design the right collaboration with a corporate, it will really be beneficial to the two parties. Think also of some strategic money, and Sid made a very interesting point. People are not just split into microbits. They can be investors and business owners and operating large supply chains. They can be activists and they can be investors. So you do have in Asia, probably more than in Europe and in the US, this sort of breed of investors where they're bringing a bit of strategic support and money. We are doing this to some extent with ID Capital. Portfolio companies benefit from our network in the industry, and the money doesn't come with the strings attached with taking corporate money. But look at the collaborations we're building with Taiwan, with Cargill, with Dole. These are the sort of things that can be highly beneficial to startups. And maybe the last point is, have you thought of your IP strategy? What kind of strings do you have attached to it? Are you free to relocate? Are you free to develop some ancillary IP? Are you free to have some new development conducive to new IP that could be very palatable to some specific partners? That's something which is often, not always, very instrumental in designing your ASEAN strategy.
That's a very good point. Thanks, Isabelle. My next question is for Amelia. It's around the type of resourcing and commitment that you have seen typically be required for an Australian startup to successfully launch in an ASEAN country. And I'd encourage you to draw on your experience of different sectors here, in addition to what you've seen in ag and food tech.
Sure. So I think one thing that we see quite often with companies through Singapore is the land and expand model. So, you know, companies come to Singapore because, you know, low barriers to entry, the ease of doing business, fantastic supply chain connectivity, and increasingly through the international freight assistance mechanism, of which Singapore is a partner with Australia, you know, more adventurous, higher GDP consumer, and then build on your success here, gain your confidence, you know, prove up with your customers, get a track record, and expand into larger consumer markets. So that does work in some instances. I think just a caution, and this has been touched on by some of my fellow panelists, is just to understand how different ASEAN or Southeast Asia is as a whole. So, you know, very separate markets, you know, we can't, you know, not remember that they're really different languages, in different economies and sort of different parts of technological transformation. So you've got to be able to tailor your business strategy to the different market. And I think, you know, Paul made that point really well in terms of farming. So it really comes down to, though, know your customers, and just don't assume that because it's a region and works really well as a region that they're all the same. The other thing is that before COVID, we used to say, you know, if you're developing your customers, you've got to be here. But I think that Isabelle put it so well in terms of, well, actually, how are you inspiring and trust? So you obviously, it's not so easy to be in the market, but avoiding that sort of fly in, fly out, to demonstrate your longer term strategy. Are you going to hire locals on the ground so that you can get traction among your customers in the industry? How are you going to be flexible to customize your solutions? And that's the language that I mentioned, but it's also the pricing, and thinking about developing pricing suitable for the market that you're pitching in at. You know, are you able to hire a trusted local who can make decisions in meetings, or will you have a fast feedback loop to Australia? So I think those are some of the things that we've seen with companies who have been successful.
Super helpful, thank you. And Paul, you have first-hand experience. What is your perspective on the resourcing and commitment that it takes to launch in an ASEAN country?
Look, it is a big step, and it's a big step from here. And I think it's a matter of thinking about what your model is going to be. And I think if you relocate substantially into ASEAN, I think that can be quite a viable model. So moving yourself into an ASEAN country and advancing your business from there, I think could be a great way to go. We've talked a lot about partnerships. So short of doing that, I think there's some great partnership options available. Isabelle's talked a bit about the VC community in Singapore, and I would certainly recommend to Australian founders to consider Singapore-based VC. I think it's a slightly different VC market than we have in Australia. I think it's a market that understands the Asian market better than Australian investors do. So I think I would certainly encourage partnerships with VC, particularly out of Singapore. But then there's all sorts of other partnerships with manufacturers and distributors in Southeast Asia. And yeah, I guess just coming back to, unless you are going to move your whole operation into Southeast Asia, I think partnership is going to be absolutely vital, and in a lot of different ways. And I think it's about picking where you want to sit in the value chain. I think for us at Ambit Robotics, we do want to focus on product development. We want to focus on research. That's something that we can do sustainably and viably in Australia. And then we need to partner out parts of the robot value chain which are closer to the customer. So it's about picking the parts of your business model that you want to do here in Australia, and the parts of the business model that are best done by a partner or by your own office in ASEAN, and being really strategic about that and aware of the upfront costs of anything that you want to set up over there.
Yeah, it brings us back to the insight that Isabelle shared about how important that strategic introspection is. It's not easy, and sometimes you just want to go, but there's so much value in really understanding the landscape a little bit. So my next question is actually on that question of understanding the landscape. And for Paul, one of the things that's really obvious, an obvious difference between Australia and Southeast Asia is the average farm size. And you've chosen to focus your product development firstly on Indonesia. Can you tell us about that choice? And also, if you've selected your next market, why did you choose the next market, and how did you conduct your market research? There's a lot.
Yeah, sure. Look, I'll deal with the question around farm size first. So in Australia, by global standards, we have very large farms, often hundreds of hectares. In Southeast Asia, a typical farm size is about a hectare. So that's 100 meters by 100 meters. It's not a large farm. And that gives rise to a very different economics. And one of the things that we've seen right across the startup landscape in Southeast Asia is that the startups that are really growing and getting investment, often they don't view the customer as the end farmer. So because, as I said, there are 73 million small family farms, if I develop a solution and I want to sell that solution to a farm, then I need to consider the acquisition cost of a very, very small business. So a 1 hectare farm located out in rural Asia somewhere, very difficult, costly to get to and engage. And we've also got a lot of farmers who aren't particularly digitally connected. So they don't necessarily have a credit card or any way of paying you. And that can make viewing farmers in Asia as a very difficult proposition. There are business models that work for those customers, but it is pretty hard. So a lot of the customers that are scaling are selling their solutions to banks, they're selling their solutions to larger agribusinesses. And in the case of Ambit Robotics, we're wanting to lease our robots to the spray contractors. So these are the people that are going from farm to farm, and they might be able to service 3 farms in a day. They might be able to service 100 farms in a month. So what that means is that you've got a customer that's a little bit bigger, and we're able to approach that customer. So that's the, I guess, a very important thing to understand is around that farm size and the very different dynamics of the market. And I think there's a lot of opportunities around any organizations that's aggregating large numbers of farmers is a much more interesting client. In terms of market selection, I think you do want to be really careful about, and as Isabelle said, there's so much variation across Southeast Asia. For us, what we were really interested in is, are the farmers outsourcing spraying? So we went around, we did surveys, we talked to people in industry. We really wanted to know if the farmer is outsourcing their spraying. If they're not outsourcing, if they're doing it themselves, it's going to be really hard for us. So we were looking for a market where they're outsourcing. And we were also looking for a market where they really valued that service. They wanted a good quality spray. They were paying top dollar to get the job done well because they were really concerned about protection for their crop. We saw that in Bandung, in Indonesia. And again, it wasn't just Indonesia, it was Bandung. So you've got this vegetable growing region really close to a capital city, and you've got just the right dynamics for us. And then we see those dynamics repeated in Thailand as well. So really strong demand from the urban market, which other speakers have alluded to, is driving farmers to want to do spraying really well and get really good crop protection. So it was just taking that time to really understand the dynamics and the farmer needs, and really break down the region and understand where we had pockets of opportunity. And like a lot of startups, all you need is somewhere to start. I mean, it might be that we can expand to 5 or 6 different countries, but if you can get a place where the value of your product is particularly pronounced in a very specific place, then I think that can be really helpful too.
Really interesting, thank you. Sid, you've worked with a number of corporates, including in regional roles that have been based out of ASEAN. What suggestions would you give to startups that are looking to work with ASEAN-based corporates as strategic partners or investors?
Thanks. I think, as I said earlier, there are a number of local corporates with very good networks and very good presence in each of these markets. I think when you look at local corporates, like any other country, any other market, you do have to look at them with a segmentation, because there are certain corporates who are more the kind of innovators, early adopters, versus others who are more content with their businesses and the business models they have in play in these markets. I think the target audience for many of the innovation-driven startups and scale-ups has to be those corporates in Asia that are the innovators and the early adopters. They are plugged into the emerging government policies around digitalization, cashless payments, around reduction of food waste, around bioproducts, sustainability, and the ESG drivers that we are looking at. They are owned by companies and owners who are looking to the future of the world, looking at solving the problems of the world, which kind of resonate with some of the emerging and new technology providers who may be based out of Australia as startups or scale-ups. So I think targeting those corporate entities as a potential partner is really where the opportunity lies. But most importantly, it's also about accessing, how do you access such partners? And I think this is where, as Paul said, ASEAN is a big region, so you've got to be focused. You've got to pick where your market is. Is it Vietnam? Is it Indonesia? Because you cannot be in all of ASEAN at once. And definitely not as a startup with, even if you have funding, it'll be driven by milestones and a time commitment in terms of which markets you want to develop. So once you've picked the market, then it is really about identifying the right partner who meets your chemistry, who meets your values. And I think the successes I have seen and some of the failures I've seen, it's very important to think about your business model. Are you looking at a distributor relationship where you're going to export your product from Australia? Or are you looking at a deeper relationship which may involve capital, which may involve equity sharing, which may involve local presence like a legal entity, which may involve an investor from Singapore, but an operation in a Vietnam or Thailand for that matter. And you would have to be open to discussing these business models. Many corporates in Asia markets, they are very proud about their nationality. They're very proud about what they've built. They're not going to roll over and offer you a deal where there is low or a very low equity for them. So they would be willing to come to the party as a partner with on an equitable and a fair basis. So I think my suggestion would be to have an open mind when you come into these markets with the business model, and be prepared to put value on the table for them to come up with their partnership and their value add from that partnership for your success. So I think that's really my view, Kate.
Put on the table for them. I think that's just a really collaborative way to think about a partnership. And I definitely encourage the startups to have that framing in mind when they're considering ASEAN markets. Thank you. Isabelle, as an investor that primarily makes Series A investments and with a deep network across Asia, you're ideally positioned to support Australian ag and food tech startups that are ready to make their first international move. Could you tell us a little bit about what you would be looking for and what might set apart one Australian startup from another?
So we are positive about Australian startups in principle. And usually that's the moment where people clap their hands. So just imagine that people are applauding. We really like Australian startups for many reasons. One of them is that they are very often grounded in science. And a startup is a risky game, and investment in a startup is a risky business. We like things that can stand the test of time. So this whole notion of trust is very important, and Australia has it. Also, there is no massive cultural gap that you cannot bridge with a few interactions, in a good old days with a few beers. So how do we approach Australian startups and how do we look at them? We have realized that, apart from Australia and to some extent Singapore, as soon as you go into an ASEAN country, you would be venturing into uncharted territories. So resilience would be important. Your capacity to adapt, your capacity to deal with ambiguity. And let me just delve into an anecdote. Years ago, in a previous life and business, I used to work for a large multinational company that was assessing their high potential managers against a very limited number of very simple criteria. One of them was the capacity to deal with ambiguity. At that time, I found it a little ridiculous. But with the years, I started to realize that it's very important. Australia, Singapore, functional, transparent, simple. As soon as you move outside these two countries, you will evolve in a more difficult context. So the support system you have in Australia and in Singapore can sometimes make you forget about the complexity of the other countries. A second point we are very focused on is the capacity to execute the plan and whether you're sufficiently funded to do so. I don't want to discourage anybody, but oftentimes your plans don't materialize as fast as you thought. And it's not that it doesn't work, it's just that it's taking more time. You don't want to be cut short by a lack of funding in the middle of your experiment in a given ASEAN country. So I'm quite careful about entrepreneurs saying we are going to go to the Philippines and Vietnam and whatever. And sometimes it smells like an investor bait. Or even sometimes, you have a deck talking extensively about the US market. All the figures are US based. And then suddenly you see ASEAN emerging in a latter part of the deck. So I know it's off topic for today, but I would like to say it's fine to not be ASEAN ready. Think about it twice, because it's a commitment, as Sid said before. Segueing into what Paul said, how manpower heavy your rollout will be. I'm very sensitive to distances. You can develop a business in Indonesia out of Singapore. You can fly every week. That's okay. You need to think differently to do it out of Australia. It is doable. Paul proves it, but you need to think differently. And the last point, where do you have an unfair advantage? In which country could you have one? I spoke yesterday to an entrepreneur who dropped me a message initially saying that they wanted to develop their solutions in the Philippines. And I quite couldn't figure out why the Philippines. Until I spoke to the guy, and he had an unfair advantage. He knew very well the context and the people and the government folks. So don't forget you're small as a startup. You're not trying to do a thesis on the market potential of autonomous weeding robots in Southeast Asia. So macroeconomics can guide you to a point. It's about whether you have an unfair advantage in a given country. And in that respect, I feel we are also looking a lot at the common sense, because for a small business, I think common sense is usually good business sense.
Amazing, thank you. Sid, what would you say about how, in response to Isabelle's comments, how would it differ from the perspective of a corporate venture?
Yeah, look, I think the basic questions remain the same, which is what is the competitive advantage of the technology? What's the route to market differentiation, the mechanisms for profitability? But I think the key factor when you look at corporate venturing, especially for the companies I've worked, which have been headquartered in the US or Europe, the startups that such corporate vehicles have screened, I would say my message to the startups is you need a lot of patience. You need a lot of patience because the corporate venture teams are very active. They're looking at probably 10 different technologies, 20 different technologies in the same space. So yours would be one of the interested technologies, but they would probably be looking at what your competitors or potential competitors are developing. And they're having those discussions in-house with their engineering teams, with their R&D teams, with their marketing teams to weigh up, which of these emerging scale-ups or startups from Australia versus from Uruguay, or we have folks from Netherlands, which ones make the most strategic sense for the corporates before making a decision. And that process of pitching to a corporate, going through the massive questions, massive time differences with a lot of people from their sides can be really tiring, and it can be really frustrating. because the corporates do not think like a VC, do not have an aspiration they may have a very well-defined fund, but because their scope is such vast and because they are a very attractive um, point of attention for many of the startups from right across the world, the time it takes for a normal corporate to screen is generally slightly longer than probably a VC. So I think that's probably a key difference. But where there are good examples of partnerships, I think the VCs as well as the corporates have a lot to offer together as well as partners, because a corporate can be a really good strategic partners, and that still has a room for a private equity or a VC or an angel investor to be in the room, because they also bring not just the wealth but also the networks to the table, which will be valued by the corporates. So I think we are in it together, the corporates, the investors, the founders, and I see this again as a collaborative route, a collaborative journey versus one trading the other,
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's a really nice note to finish the kind of the formal part of the panel discussion on. Thank you, Sid, and thank you to all of our panelists. We can now move to the questions that some of the attendees have posed on the chat. Thank you. And I'd encourage the rest of our audience to post their questions on the chat as well. I can start with a question from Michael, and I think this one is probably a good one for Paul, and I'd also encourage other panelists to join in after Paul's responded. So Paul, the question is, what opportunities and networks are there for procurement teams who are sourcing specialised ag equipment from ASEAN countries into Australia? How might we find the most needed products for Australian ag and food tech startups, ones that ASEAN innovators are using, and make them available to Australian industry?
Oh, gee.
Kind of thinking about what we talked about briefly before about ASEAN being a source of not just customers, but partners in other sense and other stakeholders within a successful startup's ecosystem.
I'm very sorry, but I'm going to pass that question over to someone else. Most of my focus has been on technology and digital tools rather than sources of agricultural inputs. So, Sid, did I see you appear then?
Yeah, I think it's a good one for Sid. Sorry, Paul, to put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, yes.
Okay.
And to your point, Kate, partnership is two ways. So, of course, there is a lot of innovation and development going on in the ASEAN system for technologies that can be adapted and tailored to the Australian environment. So I think it's really around the networks. So the Futures Asia, the work that Amelia and Austrade are doing, the work evokeAG is doing, these are really the rich forums where interested parties, both from ASEAN and Australia, this is really the meeting point of those interested people who have the enthusiasm to take their technologies from wherever they are invented to the, to the neighborhood or to the front and the backyards. And I think, when I look at some of the case examples that I've been involved in, I have seen that Australian corporates investing in Thailand, building a production facility, but the first target market for those products was not Southeast Asia or ASEAN. It was actually back home in Tasmania. So the idea of putting that technology in a Thailand, having a local setup through an acquisition by the Australian entities, working with the governments to get various incentives around exports, was really to make sure that the technology is produced in an environment where it is native, which happened to be in Thailand in this instance, but the home market is where the technology had a home from a sales point of view. So I think there are examples, and I think this probably requires another forum for you guys to organize to talk about, how do you take ASEAN into Australia? But clearly those opportunities exist.
Kate, it's Amelia here. Perhaps I can just add.
I'd love you to.
Oh, thanks. I just think, we typically have had a mandate which has been trade and investment. It's in the title, Australian Trade and Investment Commission, and that has been about sourcing, foreign direct investment, so smarts from around the world and bringing it to Australia and then taking Australian capability out into the world. And I guess what we've just seen over the last few years is that it's not a linear path. It's not something comes to Australia, something leaves Australia. It's that partnership word that we'll never get away from because it's so important, but it's about, bringing technology to Australia that is then worked on in collaboration and then perhaps forms part of our export chain. So a lot of our great investors into Australia then turn around and do things that then end up with an end product that's exported back into the region. So I think that's something that we're seeing, which is fantastic, is that it's just so collaborative and it's really two-way or multi-way rather than just trade and investment.
Great. Thanks, Amelia. Thanks, Sid. This next question I do think is probably for Paul, and it is, how can we make Australian agri-food innovation affordable to Indonesia's smallholder farmers? And remembering that there are 40 million of them. How do we feel about that one, Paul?
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Look, I think we do need to ask ourselves, if something's affordable and scalable within the Australian market, it may not be economically viable in ASEAN. So sometimes it just might not be something that's got a fit given the economics in the region. I think, as I said, we can look off farm, so we can look further up the value chain, where I think perhaps things look a little bit more similar to Australia and there's some larger customers at play there. And I think that can be a great place to start for an Australian business to look at the B2B market rather than the business to farmer market. In ASEAN, that can be a way to find a viable business model. You've obviously got the option of manufacturing products locally in ASEAN, which will typically be cheaper than it would be to manufacture something here in Australia. So that might be another way that you could get your cost point right for the ASEAN market. And then there's some really great incentives around from some of the aid and development players, from the government, to support the rollout of agri-tech into Southeast Asia, which might be another way in which you could get things going.
Yeah, a few of our panelists today have touched on those questions of regulation, support, kind of the regulatory landscape in each of the ASEAN countries and how different they are. And I do think it's a really important part of the market research that a startup needs to do. Thanks, Paul. Amelia, you've seen much more than agri-food tech in your role at Austrade. Have you seen some other sectors that have successfully made the transition to Southeast Asia? And maybe could you share with us some examples?
Sure. So I think one that we're really proud of, I guess, is a Landing Pad alumni, Matchbox Exchange, who have a technology platform around shipping container availability. And I think, more than ever now, that has been a challenge for, we've had this shortage of shipping containers, and it's just about creating efficiencies through a platform. And I guess the things that worked really well in that case was in their particular model, it was land and expand. So, the owner started in Singapore, joined the Landing Pad program, and just really hustled in terms of getting a couple of cornerstone customers. And so then working with those key customers to understand their regional needs. And that has really seen them be able to expand out into other countries in the region. So tapping on the availability, not just of the Australian government offering, but also the Singapore government offering as well. And then really in this particular case, a strong customer pull.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a question for me, which is, Kate, can you share some insights about the pathways that ADB supports, and how is ADB creating markets in and around ASEAN? How can startups and scale-ups tap into these? So I'm part of the Agribusiness investment team, which works with private sector partners in Asia and the Pacific. So my team is supporting food and agri innovation in the region by enabling a vibrant and resilient agribusiness value chain from seeds to supermarkets, we say. And so since 2012, ADB has invested more than $740 million in agribusiness in the region. Specifically for startups, ADB also provides support through ADB Ventures, which provides seed and early stage equity and helps startups expand into new markets and leverages ADB's relationships. And the focus of ADB Ventures is on a high impact clean tech, fintech, health tech, and agri-tech innovations in developing Asia. I know that Amelia, Austrade and ADB Ventures have recently partnered with great success. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about that?
Sorry,
Amelia.
Have you got me there?
That's okay. Yes, we do now. Thank you.
So I don't actually have an update on where things are at in the Philippines, except to say that we are running programs with ADB and looking at how we might, scope out Australian capability and tech and bring it in through your ADB pipeline. And our office in the Philippines has been really focused on that and running sort of one-off programs. Not to say that we couldn't look at sort of a model where if interested parties on the line were thinking about, how to tap into ADB, that Austrade could also be a partner in helping them access that.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one final question, and it's going to be one for Sid. And again, I'd encourage our other panelists to provide their perspective as well. Sid, we've talked quite a lot today about partnerships and relationships and how valuable those can be. How important really is it for an Australian startup to have a local partner when launching in ASEAN? Have you seen a startup successfully go it alone, or is it essential to have a partner?
Yeah, look, I have seen a partner which was actually a corporate, not a startup. They did have the funding in-house to do it alone and did it quite successfully, are doing it quite successfully as we speak. But I must say, as a startup, generally it would probably be a good strategy to have a local partner, because you need to navigate through a lot of, as people said, a lot of local regulations. Depending on your product, you might also need to navigate through the government systems in terms of setting yourself up, in terms of bringing your technologies in, or even looking at how do you bring your intellectual property into some of these markets for exploitation. So I think for a startup, my general recommendation would be, as we've discussed before, the right partner who gets you the access to the networks, potentially the investors, has the access to the regulators, to the government departments, because many of these countries still have a very different political environment than Australia in terms of bringing products to market. Somebody mentioned halal, so halal is a very important consideration in the industry. So certainly having a local partner will help, because you are entering a new country, and if you can share your cost and the time in terms of how you intend to bring those technologies to the market, it's probably going to be more efficient and more accelerated versus you on your own trying to reinvent the wheel in some of these complex economies. But by any means, if your technology is a know-how with very sensitive intellectual property, then there may be a case to see if you want to do it alone, but be prepared to play a patient game in that scenario.
Absolutely, and that comes back to what we were discussing before about the commitment and the resources that's required. Yeah, there can be a way to accelerate, but you may need to give up some of your equity along the way to get your product to commercialization faster. Yeah, I'm not sure if any of the other panelists wanted to add in their perspective on that same question about the importance of having a partner, or whether they've seen successful examples of an Australian startup making it on their own in ASEAN. Perhaps not, and we may actually be out of time. I did very quickly see one question from Han about information on the on ADB rules for Australian businesses that, to have access to ADB approved funding. So Han, I would encourage you, and I'd encourage everybody who's interested in exploring opportunities with ADB Ventures to reach out to ADB Ventures directly, and they should be able to provide you with that information. Great, so thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. I'd like to extend a very, very warm thank you to our panelists, to Sid, Amelia, Paul and Isabelle. Thanks for the attendees who've joined us from all around the world, especially those who've endured difficult time zones. That's a really wonderful commitment, so thank you. If you'd like any more information about the topics that we've discussed today, the contact details for Abhinav at ID Capital, and the website for the Singapore landing pad and evokeAG startup resources are on the screen there. We'd also encourage you to please complete the feedback form. So the link should be in the chat box. Perhaps not yet, but there we go. We've got the link in the chat box. And we'll also send it to you by email. It should take only a few minutes to complete. There are only 3 questions, but it's really helpful to us. So thanks again to everyone, and I'm really looking forward to hearing news of successful launches of Australian ag and food tech startups and scale-ups in ASEAN. Best of luck.